Next 50 years, climate-related challenges and comparative approaches to conservation. Really, really fantastic panel. Lisa Van Atta is here to moderate, and I'm going to introduce Lisa, and then she can introduce you to the panelists. But Lisa has spent over 25 years with NOAA, and she's a double threat, a fisheries biologist with a law degree, so this is going to be awesome, and I'm going to turn it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Andy. Gosh, what a pleasure to be here. In over 26 years, I've been to a lot of ESA conferences, as you may imagine, maybe some of them with many of you in the room, but I found the dialogue at this one really engaging, and that's what we're going to perpetuate into this last afternoon session. So start thinking of your questions as our panelists are speaking, because we want it to be pretty interactive. Just quickly, what I will say is, since we haven't talked about National Marine Fisheries Service too much, and I'll be real brief, so as you might expect, our mandate is stewardship over the nation's marine resources and habitats, and I emphasize habitats as well. So basically, we implement, among other things, the ESA for marine species. Across NMFS, we have about 4,000 employees, and I was trying to get some statistics on how many of those work on ESA issues. I'm sorry I came up short there, but some percentage of those 4,000 work on ESA issues. But not a lot. We have got a pretty strong Magnuson Act mandate, which is ocean fisheries and harvest. So a lot of our resources go there. We pale to the Fish and Wildlife Service in the amount of species we have listed under our jurisdiction. 165 only, and 80 of those are endangered and 85 are threatened. And so pretty even split. But per capita, that means that NMFS has a bit more resources to put into the species under our jurisdiction. So I just want to make that point. And quickly, I lead the California Coastal Office of NMFS. I've worked in other areas around the country, including the Northwest and the Pacific Islands. I've been in California now for about 10 years. And because this panel is going to be talking about climate change, like many of you, climate change is now, it's not in the future. My office has suffered catastrophic wildfires that have not only affected our team members and staff, but also, for example, here's just one relevant example, destroyed one of the last remaining conservation hatcheries for endangered coho salmon. So it's real, and we're dealing with it, and it makes our job a lot tougher. So I'm interested in what this panel has to say. So our panel is climate and comparative approaches, as you know. But really what ties this together is what's really exciting over the next 50 years. And I'm quoting Jim on that, so thank you, Jim. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce the panel. We're going to have a couple of short presentations, and then we'll go to questions. So it's my privilege to introduce this esteemed panel. So I'll start with Rachel. Dr. Rachel Silverstein joined the Miami Waterkeeper as the Executive Director and Waterkeeper in June of 2014. Since then, she has led the team in numerous water wins, ranging from protecting and restoring corals to ensuring that nuclear power plants account for climate change to stopping sewage leaks. Her work is driven by science and research and covers hyper-local campaigns with wide-ranging impacts. We're going to hear more about that from Rachel. Next, I'm going to introduce Tim Mayle. Tim founded the Environmental Policy Innovation Center in 2017. Prior to launching this startup, he served as an associate director of the White House's Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ. He was a co-director of agriculture policy at the Environmental Defense Fund and in various other nonprofit roles. His work includes an extensive focus on wildlife and water quality, regulatory and voluntary offset programs, especially in the United States. And then last but not least, Jim Salzman, Professor Salzman. So Jim is the Donald Bren Distinguished Professor at UCLA Law School, go Bruins, and the UCSB School of the Environment. Professor Salzman's broad-ranging scholarship has addressed topics spanning from water law and policy, trade and environmental conflicts, and the legal and institutional issues creating market for ecosystem services. Finally, Jim visits Harvard every fall teaching a range of environmental courses. So that's the wonderful panel you have before us, and we're going to start today with Rachel's presentation. Rachel? Oh, of course. Perfect.
I'll trade seats with you. Okay. Well, really honored to be here, and I think we are the two non-lawyers in the audience, although I do feel like I play one on TV sometimes. But if I get any of the law wrong, direct your complaints to Eric Litzenstein, who taught me most of what I know about the Endangered Species Act. So it has actually been so interesting to be here already today. I had so many conversations with many people that left me feeling actually hopeful and inspired, because all of you are out there protecting the next 50 years of the Endangered Species Act and have dedicated your lives to making sure these species persist into the future. So that really means a lot, and especially to the students who are here. We need you in the fight, and definitely look us up for externships down the road. I hope you'll indulge me a little bit in a bit of a personal narrative of my own experience with the Endangered Species Act, and as a brand new water keeper on the job that started in June of 2014 and is still ongoing. So it's been a solid decade of fun with corals in the Endangered Species Act. But I'll start a little bit. Let me see, can I pick this up, or can you hear me? Is that better? So major threats to corals I'll go over very, very quickly, and my PhD is specifically in the effect of climate change on corals, and that is the #1 threat facing corals worldwide, specifically high temperature and ocean acidification effects, and that's synergistic with other threats facing corals like water pollution, coastal construction, and diseases, as well as overfishing and marine debris. In 2006, the first 2 corals were listed as threatened under the ESA. They're staghorn and elkhorn corals. They're both in the Acropora genera. In 2014, 20 more corals were added, all as threatened, 5 in the Caribbean and 13 in the Indo-Pacific. There were originally, I think, 82 or 83 corals petitioned, which went to 66, and then ultimately these 20 were listed. In 2023, the pillar coral was actually proposed for uplisting to endangered, and that would be the first endangered coral. If there is a charismatic megafauna of corals, it is the pillar coral. It has these long tentacles that kind of float in the water, and it looks sort of like a Muppet. Charismatic megapolyp, I think you called it earlier, which I liked. So it's actually thought that the pillar coral, interestingly enough, has been functionally extinct in Florida for about 50 years. So it hasn't had likely sexual reproduction where gametes from different individuals can actually meet in the water column because they're so spread out. But it has been having this asexual reproduction where it can break and then start a new individual. And corals are clonal animals, so you can actually cut them into pieces and have a new individual. And that is one of the things that made these listings so interesting, and the listing of invertebrates so difficult and challenging generally. But first of all, there are thousands of species of corals, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Many of them look similar. We talked earlier about the difficulty identifying whether or not it's a grizzly bear. There are probably 5 people in the world, if that, who can tell the difference between many of these Indo-Pacific coral species. Coral spawn, they have this microscopic life stage where they're floating around in the water column and potentially getting, entrained in power plants or having other sorts of take when they're in this larval stage. How do you deal with that? And then what is an individual? As I mentioned, if you take one coral and you cut it up into 100 pieces, did you just increase the population by 100? We can talk about that later. And then finally, of course, climate change being the #1 threat to corals is extremely difficult to address and deal with, as we talked about with the polar bear. But I do want to go through this case study, and I will do this as quickly as I can, of the dredging of the Port of Miami. from 2013 to 2015, this project occurred, deepening and widening the shipping channel to make way for these supersized shipping vessels that were coming through the Panama Canals, deepening and widening, and coming up and down the eastern seaboard. All these ports were deepening and widening. So here is the Florida Reef Tract going up and down the coast. The Port Miami shipping channel crosses it, and so does the Port Everglades shipping channel about 30 miles north, which is also planned for expansion, but hasn't happened yet, which I'll get to. Let's see if this works. I don't know if the video will play. That's okay. Get the idea. So it was my 4th day as the water keeper in June of 2014. And I had just finished working in the Senate on the Commerce Committee, and I had just started as water keeper. I was trying to figure out how to run a nonprofit, and I figured I'd, read books about running a nonprofit for a couple months before I really, dug in. And I've, newsflash, still never read a book on how to run a nonprofit. But I got this call from the New York Times on the 4th day and said, people are saying that there's sediment covering corals during the Port of Miami dredging. What do you know about it? So I said, when's your deadline on that? And immediately started making calls and looking into it. And pretty quickly realized that there were major violations of the state permit and of the Endangered Species Act going on. And I wanted to go out and see for myself. So this is Jim Porter, who is our local attorney and also boat captain. And I was expert witness and client. And we went out and dove in. I don't know if there's a way to get the videos to play, but, oh, does that work? That's okay. I did something bad, I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix it. Is there a way to put it back in presentation mode? Okay, I'm gonna keep going until somebody hears me back there. Mayday, thank you, okay. Well, I dove in and got to the bottom to see what the reef looked like, and there were no colors. It was a moonscape. And I thought for sure we were on a sandbar, this wasn't the reef. We gotten the coordinates wrong. And as I started swimming, and I swam as far as I could on a tank of air, this is what it looked like. I saw no end to the moonscape. Oh, there we go, thank you. And then I started to realize that there were these sea fans and sea whips sticking out of the sediment. And by definition, they have to be attached to the exposed hard bottom on a reef. And so then I started to realize this is the reef and it has all been buried. The current was ripping, I could hardly see my hand in front of my face, and you could feel the vibration of the dredge ship operating next to you. So I started to realize how serious this damage was, and in looking into it, found out, essentially, the first thing I found out was that before dredging started, they had only anticipated sediment in a 150-meter impact area on the reef, and this is one of 3 linear reefs that make up the Florida Reef Tract. This is the middle reef, and this was the one that had the most damage, ultimately, but also was the one where they found listed staghorn corals present. The survey they had done 3 years before the dredging started said there were only 31 of these staghorn corals in the area. They consulted with NOAA. NOAA said just move them out of the way to these green sites here. That, of course, ended up being too close to the dredging, and those were also ultimately buried in sediment. But NOAA said, you have an incidental take statement to relocate the 31 staghorn corals, and 5 of them might die in relocation, and that's okay. But they never anticipated that the dredging sediment would actually kill or do permanent damage to critical habitat or to the corals themselves. When the dredging was about to begin, a company went in to relocate the 31 corals and move them to the sites, and they swam these blue survey lines. You can see they didn't finish up here on the north side of the channel, and they had already found 243 staghorn corals. They got out of the water. They called the Army Corps and said, what do we do now? Who remembers what was happening in the federal government in October of 2013? It's the government shutdown and furlough. So folks were not at their desks. They had an informal call with NOAA. NOAA said, oh, these corals are safe. Just move the 38 that are within 50 feet of the channel, this white dotted line, and monitor the rest of them and reinitiate consultation. They moved the 38, they never reinitiated consultation formally, and they never monitored the rest of the corals in the area. And they never even finished the survey to this day. And of course, spectacular displays of sedimentation occurred. This is all of the Port of Miami. This is Fisher Island, for those of you who know Miami, the Sunset Islands. Just look at the size of that plume next to the area, and this is right on top of the reef. This is the staghorn corals buried in sediment. And this is a large plating coral, Diploria, buried in sediment. So just almost 6 weeks later, we filed a notice of intent to sue. And one of these folks is Eric. I don't know which one. Because Meyer and Glitzenstein represented us along with some local attorneys. And in the intervening 60-day notice period, NOAA said to the Corps, you have to go monitor these corals. So they said every other week we'll go out and we'll see how they're doing. They got the results of the first survey back and saw them all buried, and then issued emergency relocation recommendations. And they said, you know, we've determined that there's clearly sediment impacting the ESA listed colonies. We're recommending the emergency relocation immediately. And then the Corps formally reinitiated consultation in the 60-day window, but they refused to move the corals and said they should stay in place. I just thought this was like an interesting comment too, that it's only third world countries that have these problems, not us. In any event, 60 days later, by October, we were filing our litigation and an emergency injunction request, and essentially the night before, 2 days before the hearing was held, the Corps ran in and said, we have a letter from NOAA, we're gonna pay them $400,000 to go in and rescue those corals that are in the area. And so we were like, okay, you know, they're moving the corals, they've reinitiated consultation, they're now monitoring them. We can't do much for our emergency injunction. But then months later, we found out, you know, through records reviews and FOIA requests and things, which we actually had to bring FOIA litigation to get the records in the end, that when the NOAA divers came for this rescue, the dredge ship was parked right on top of the corals, and the NOAA divers couldn't get in, and the Army Corps had essentially refused to relocate the dredge ship even for a few days to let the NOAA divers come in and rescue the corals. The ship broke or something happened for 2 days and they had to go in, so they did get some of the corals that went to University of Miami's Marine School. But they essentially said, this is from the NOAA attorney to his team, that the Corps said the only way to locate the dredge would be too expensive. So they wouldn't do it, even though they had, you know, told the court that they shouldn't grant our injunction because they were gonna rescue the corals. Again, by the time we found out about this, the project was almost done. We had some very strongly worded warning letters from NOAA that this effect is a take. It was out of, you know, it was not predicted in the biop, and included, or the incidental take statement, and it's affecting critical habitat. And the EPA as well sent some letters about improper disposal of dredging material, affecting federally listed species because there was leaking sediment out to the ODMDS, which was not allowed. And the EPA actually, to this day, is the only agency who's done enforcement. So they actually brought civil penalties against the dredging company, about $500,000 of penalties. The Army Corps continued to deny that there was any impact, and we spent a lot of time having to prove that this was going on. They even filed this photo in court saying it was taken after the dredging had ended, 450 meters from the channel. And here's a happy, healthy staghorn coral. There's nothing to worry about. But I noticed that there's this weird copyright mark on the bottom, and found the photo online. It had been taken in 1992 in the Cayman Islands. And so it had to be retracted. The Army Corps biologist had to write an affidavit that she had done this inadvertently, except 2 weeks later, she did the same thing again at a public hearing for the dredging of Port Everglades up in Fort Lauderdale. This photo was given out to the public along with these frequently asked questions that nothing happened in Miami. There was no excessive coral damage. Critics of the deepening project made numerous statements overstating the effect and degree of the project, and in no way threatened the overall viability of the endangered species. So this is a healthy relocated colony recorded following construction at Miami Harbor. I recognize this photo as having been taken at the baseline survey right after relocation before the project started. They had to retract that too. They sent letters to the colonel. They said they were both inadvertent errors. About 2 years later, that individual is actually indicted by the Environmental Crimes Department at the Department of Justice in Miami for lying to federal agents, having lied about taking money that was undisclosed from an environmental monitoring firm on a major South Florida dredging project. So she left the Corps. And then the environmental monitoring firm on the project also, I believe, participated in this cover-up and wrote final reports after huge contracts, monitoring corals for years, 1 year after dredging. What was the permanent impact of this project? Just 6 out of 224 corals died, and that represents the only permanent impact of the project. So I spent a year with my PhD colleagues and a remote sensing scientist reanalyzing all the raw data from the project. We published this in 2019 and proved that millions of corals were likely killed and a 25-kilometer area of reef was impacted. Just this past August, or in August of 23, we got an impact report from NOAA, and this is just the extent of where their survey went, not the extent of the damage, and just on one of 3 reef areas, and they backed up all of our findings that likely millions of corals were killed and that 278 acres of reef was destroyed or impacted by dredging sediment. So it's about $1 to $6 million an acre to restore reefs. So we have, conservatively $1 billion mitigation project that's never been fulfilled, and this damage has never been mitigated. We're trying to get some mitigation out of it, and we have proposals and plans on what could be done. But everybody sort of moved on. They've said this has happened 10 years ago, and are on to the next project. So we're still trying to get mitigation and enforcement from this, and the agencies, except for the EPA on the dredging company, never issued notices of violation or took other enforcement action other than those warning letters. We did get 10,000 of these staghorn corals replaced, and the Army Corps and Miami-Dade County paid for their restoration, and they were some of the first restored corals ever observed to be reproducing in the wild. So it's a little bit of a silver lining. But we didn't know at the time of settlement how, we hadn't done that full analysis to know that millions of corals were killed and all the other corals in the area and the habitat that was destroyed. And then there was a massive disease outbreak that has spread throughout the Florida Reef Tract and now around the Caribbean that's killed tens of millions of corals and caused local extinctions. And there's a growing body of evidence that the dredging project may have sparked or accelerated this coral disease. It was first observed right next to the dredging project in the middle of dredging. And some of these studies show, for example, if you put healthy corals and diseased corals in a tank, it takes about 2 weeks for the healthy corals to get the disease. But if you put them in a tank with sediment, it's about 24 hours. So you can imagine a disease existing in the environment, then hitting a bunch of immune-compromised corals that have been buried in sediment, and the sediment transferring the disease between corals, that this is how it potentially got into epidemic levels and has now affected multiple regions. And again, as I said, potentially caused local extinctions of different coral species. So for future dredging projects, Port Everglades was supposed to start in 2017. We brought NEPA and ESA claims against NOAA and the Corps here, and they agreed to redo their environmental assessment, so that's been going on ever since. I just recently actually went diving in the area, and there were lots of healthy staghorn corals and a recently listed queen conch. This is probably the last place in Florida where you can see staghorn corals like this after last summer's bleaching event. Killed many of them in the southern part of the reef tract, and they found about 40,000 queen conch, one of the largest populations that we know of, right at the mouth of the channel. And the Corps, NOAA sent this letter to the Corps just this past May, that this would be the largest permitted impact to coral reefs in US history if this project were to go forward. And then 5 days later, NOAA, the Corps sent their BA to NOAA asking them to start working on the biop by the end of the year. And NOAA responded in July saying that the BA contains significant factual and analytical flaws, and significant sections of the BA are unintelligible. So we're paying more attention this time. The needle is moving. We're getting we've seen some improvements. They're making some concessions, but ultimately the political forces to get this port dredged are very strong, and the Corps is trying to ram this through and to pressure NOAA into giving them a biological opinion with no plan to mitigate for the millions of corals that they're expecting to kill from this project. In San Juan Harbor, we worked with Center for Biological Diversity, Catherine, on this. They brought litigation to try to stop the dredging in San Juan Harbor because many of the same mistakes were repeated. And this is, again, showing that they're going back to that 150-meter indirect impact zone, again, for that project, and not monitoring any corals outside of that area, even though we had thousands of meters of impact in Miami. So there was no take coverage, ultimately, for the sedimentation impacts. There's a real need for scientific oversight and third-party review because a lot of these environmental monitoring firms, not all of them, but a lot of them are on the same contracts as these dredging companies or construction companies, and essentially are put in the position of needing to report that their bosses are in violation of the Endangered Species Act or other acts, and that puts them in a very hard situation. So we need to break apart that conflict, in my opinion, and have more third-party review and oversight and separate contracts for the environmental monitoring. And then it's very hard to do enforcement when it's a government action agency. Who is supposed to fix this? We only have injunctive relief, and once the project is over, that becomes very difficult. But there is still an unmitigated disaster, literally unmitigated, off of the coast of Miami. And it's very difficult to get anybody to pay that much money to fix it, especially when the impact is so big. Once the project's already started, there's massive barriers to enforcement. There was a real reluctance to do adaptive management because of how much it would cost. For example, we have lots of emails to that effect. And also, by the time we could get information about what was going on, the project was almost over, and that really limited our ability to do citizen suit enforcement as well. Climate change, I know that I'm probably over time, so we will talk about this in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. In the interest of time, we're going to move directly to Tim's presentation.
Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I am a fan of the analogies between the ESA and wildlife management and the medical system. And so just to give a kind of a slightly different example than the emergency room, cervical cancer is close to 100% treatable if discovered early. 40% of patients are now screened early, and that cancer is caught. And it varies by population and across the country, but something like 90% are successfully treated. Colon cancer has not quite as high of a success rate of treatment, and definitely not as high of a rate of early detection. But there's a system that has figured out how to do that, how to scale, right? How to deal with millions of patients that need screening, and then millions of patients that need treatment. And it works. And that's repeated all over the place. And so, no, that's not, no. Well, most of the data is somehow missing from this slide. But this is a conservative estimate of how many species are really endangered in the United States. The pie, the red, the orange, and the yellow show NatureServe or IUCN G1, G2, G3 species. There are roughly 33,000 species that NatureServe looked at when they did this, and found 39% of those species, of all the species in the US that they looked at, fit in one of these categories. 5% are on the endangered species list. Now, that's just 33,000 of the species in the United States. The estimates of how many species live in the United States, including invertebrates, which are mostly not on this chart, go from 100,000 to 400,000, right? So that is a super conservative estimate. To make it worse, most of that data has nothing to do with climate change. That's a lot of old data. Many of these species have been in those categories since the 1970s, right? So that is a very conservative picture. 12,000 species to 80,000 species in the United States are actually at risk of extinction because of climate change. And I point that out because everything we're doing under the ESA, not everything, I'm simplifying it, we're doing the right stuff, right? But we are nowhere close to screening patients when they're at stage 1 cancer levels or treating them, right? We're admitting a tiny fraction of patients, not to the ER, just to treatment, where we have a really high failure rate. And I'll say failure rate is like they're stuck here forever, right? Stuck in the hospital. Kind of gloomy at 4 o'clock at the end of the meeting, but this is climate change. This is reality, right? And so we've built a system. The way I think of the ESA, people like to use the word pilots in government. I think of the whole ESA as a pilot program. It was basically, could we create a system to identify species? Smithsonian Institute, go out, create a list, quick list, 100 species on the list originally in the 70s. Go ahead and figure out if we can create a system that can identify and then do something about endangerment. And we've gotten stuck in a pilot that is intensely slow and procedural and cumbersome for this tiny fraction of species. And so what I was asked to talk about in the context of climate change is kind of a lean toward private lands. I've done a lot of work in my career. Lisa mentioned some of it, working on the Farm Bill, working on HTPs, safe harbor agreements, candidate conservation agreements, worked for the state of Hawaii for a while, was a local government official for a while, elected official. I'm not very good at holding down jobs, apparently. And so what can we do that leads to scaling up, right? So on the one hand, we need to scale up the things that we're recognizing as species that our wildlife agency, it's not an Endangered Species Act agency, it's a wildlife agency, a national one, that they're helping with. And there's lots of great grant programs that are part of that picture, and lots of programs like the Partners Program at Fish and Wildlife Service that are partly working on that issue. We also need to figure out how to let other people that maybe don't have advanced degrees or law degrees, contribute. And a lot of those people and the businesses they represent might be a ranch, or a small family farm, or a major corporation, are not engaged the way they would like to be in wildlife conservation and species conservation. And I don't think we can come close to doing what we need to do to deal with climate change and endangered species, wildlife imperilment in the United States alone, unless we get their help. There's a lot of pieces of getting their help, right? And so like one of the things is, I have a slide at the end here that just kind of lists a bunch of ideas for conversation, is no longer requiring permits, ESA, NEPA, or a whole host of local permits for ecological restoration, if you know what you're doing. Many of you have probably had home construction projects with an electrician in your house. The electrician is certified to install electrical outlets. We trust that they know what they're doing. And I'd posit that the field of wildlife management, people like the Nature Conservancy or Ducks Unlimited know what they're doing, and they should far more often be able to do restoration with private landowners, with private businesses, with local government, where they don't have to spend a long time trying to get a permit. A good example of that, since we're in Massachusetts, is some of the Massachusetts conservation groups have been trying to do some restoration in Great Salt Marsh in Massachusetts. Have spent years and years in permitting to fix what are essentially old drainage ditches across the marsh. Have spent somewhere between $250,000 to $500,000 in trying to get the restoration project of the salt marsh completed, which is literally filling these little, straight ditches through the wetland. Countless examples that we hear about all the time. Beaver dam analogs in the West, small prescribed burns anywhere in the country, which are difficult. And unless we let those things go, and there's lots of good reasons why wildlife agencies and local governments kind of don't want to let go of a role in them. One reason is because that's the stuff that people love. Like they're tired of working on all the things, reviewing pesticides and road projects. They actually like working on ecological restoration projects. But unless we make them stop and we let people who really know what they're doing do that thing, we're never going to get to restoration at scale. We're never going to get to that kind of cervical cancer stage 1 treatment unless we have their help. I'm going to just touch on this in a different way than Jim is later on, but around the world, it'll start in the United States. We've struggled for a couple decades to figure out, like, how do we really keep track of biodiversity? How do we measure it? Yes, wildlife and nature are super complicated, but there's something like $6 billion from venture capital firms that have gone into nature tech startups in the last 5 years. And increasingly, the companies, many of which are private, not all of which are private, some are public ventures, are figuring out ways to categorize biodiversity using, of course, satellite data, which we've had for 20 years, getting better, but increasingly drones, remote sensing, AI, using human observers, using systems like Merlin or apps like Seek you have in your phones, to pull together information that in a much more standardized way characterize biodiversity across large pieces of property, and then make sense of it. And the example I'm using here is for a Danish company called Ramboll, owned by a foundation, a little bit like the company that makes Ozempic. And Ramboll has 15,000 staff. What they've done, they just launched this at the COP meeting 2 weeks ago, excuse me, is they took a regulatory metric from England that's used for mitigation associated with a program called Biodiversity Net Gain. They took that metric that takes basic botany data. Botanists go out in the field and look at plant communities. You take botany data, plant community data, stick it together with obviously information on the areal or the extent of the habitat, along with national rankings of which ecosystems are the most important, along with national data on within an ecosystem, which areas are most important, for example, for connectivity between habitats, or for just the resilience of a patch of habitat. And then risk, the likelihood that projects there would succeed. To build this system that allows you to score at a much more fine scale, what's going on with biodiversity. And Ramboll took this from England and they've now applied it in America and 26 other countries. So the idea of kind of universal metrics for nature are starting to take off, completely outside the space of our regulatory agencies. I've not yet met anyone at the Fish and Wildlife Service who knows about this, but it's crucial for private landowners to be able to figure out, what do I have today and can I make it better? Many landowners think they can. They want to help wildlife. And tools like this can help create, one, baseline data, and two, show documented ways that you can create uplifts. We're better in some habitats than others. Some endangered species and threatened species are super hard to help. Others are easier to help. So I wanted to mention this as a really important frontier to get up to the scale of tens of thousands of species. And then some of the work that could make the biggest difference on private lands are biodiversity credits. So most of you are familiar with mitigation and habitat banks or mitigation banks, 404 banks, Clean Water Act. The basic concept is somebody takes a piece of property that either needs to be preserved or restored and is able to, after doing that and putting in place a management plan and management funding, sell credits from that activity to someone else who needs mitigation credits, like the Army Corps, if they're willing to buy them. And so there's a big global effort underway to try to create voluntary biodiversity credits that are effectively mostly going to be helping companies that are trying to deal with their whole supply chain impact, deal with that impact, offset that impact. And so in the United States, again, we're not paying a lot of attention to this right now, but it has enormous promise because many of the kind of bigger companies in the United States some of them operate internationally, so they're already facing this internationally. But even if they're only US companies, many of them have European investors or Japanese investors. And those investors are saying, what are you doing about biodiversity? How are you keeping track of biodiversity within your direct footprint and your supply chain footprint? What are you doing about it? How are you offsetting it? How are you avoiding it? It's a huge business opportunity for American farmers, ranchers, anyone with land. It's potentially a business opportunity for local government and state government where they own land, where they have no management funds to pay for restoration or enhancement, invasive species control in those lands. It's a huge opportunity for tribes. And much of the work that's going on internationally is led by and focused on indigenous held lands or traditional rights areas, all of whom are trying to figure out how to get revenue from a quantified unit of biodiversity that has additionality, has durability, has a bunch of features that you all might recognize in a mitigation credit, and bring those supplies of credits to buyers, not who operate as the global carbon market does in a kind of globally fungible sense. 1 pound of or 1 ton of carbon is the same everywhere you go, but for local impacts, right? So if there's a car production facility that Volvo owns in South Carolina, which there is, and Volvo says, what could we do in this area to much more significantly offset the impact of our entire supply chain serving that plant? How do we do that? There is an answer associated with these credits, but making them relevant to, like in this case of South Carolina, forest landowners and others who could create biodiversity uplift for a set of ecosystems that are similar to the ecosystems affected throughout that supply chain. No idea why the slides are mostly missing all their words. They're definitely not missing their words on my computer. So I'm just going to skip to this slide. The last piece is finance. And the key thing that comes up associated with private lands, private companies, mitigation credits, pipelines, transmission lines, wind and solar farms, is how can we get a lot of private capital to make, to invest in nature positive things. And what most often comes up is that there are not clear signals for what private capital should do. So while the Fish and Wildlife Service may or may not list sage grouse or lesser prairie chicken or monarch butterfly, and those kind of decisions are important, what companies and investors also need to know is, are there places, are there types of ecosystems where you would really like us to invest? Which are the most important 10 habitats, the most climate imperiled habitats in the United States that need restoration or need land protection? It's not regulatory, right? But what they need the agency and experts, NGOs, to tell them is these are places that if you put money, we will stand with you to say that the way you're putting money on the ground is valuable, is likely to have a long-term benefit for biodiversity. We guarantee we'll stand with you if you do that, like we'll put it in writing. That these are the right places to put money, and what they often say is the agency just won't tell us where we should do the thing, where we should spend the money. So they really don't know, right? Like they have one biologist on staff, agencies have dozens or hundreds. They really want to know where to put dollars, and they really need the agencies to tell them that. Again, outside the regulatory context. So for me, the last kind of comment I'll make is if you're thinking about this as a beyond compliance or a ESA plus system, it's a lot of forecasting by science teams, by recovery teams, by experts and pollinators at the Fish and Wildlife Service. And as I said before, I posit that we need state agencies too, which have 5 times more employees than the Fish and Wildlife Service does. That basically says these are the places we want you to make a bet on trying to keep ecosystems intact, keep species present. And we will, if you make investments there, we will continue to focus on those places too. We'll try to find some way to create basically a positive feedback loop on those investments. So thank you.
Yeah, panel is going to resume their places, and we're turning it over to Jim. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I'm going old school, but if you prefer staring at the screen instead of me, that's okay. I won't be offended. So I'm going to focus on the sort of comparative approaches of this panel. And as Lisa said, I want to talk about exciting stuff outside the U.S. All right, so comparative in terms of abroad. I don't see major changes happening with the Convention on Migratory Species, on Convention on Biological Diversity on site. I think it's going to be kind of similar to what we've seen so far. So what I'm going to focus on is 2 what I kind of consider second-order initiatives. So these are not specifically focused on biodiversity, but they have biodiversity impact because they're focusing more on sort of habitat conservation. And I hope you don't know much about this, so I can sort of share it with you. The first is natural capital accounting. The second I'm sure you've heard about but may not know much about, which is rights of nature. So those 2, I'm excited about them, and I hope you will be as well. So natural capital, I'm sure many of you know the phrase. It basically is a term that talks about sort of the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources in the environment. So it could be plants, animals, air, water, soil, minerals, and it yields a flow of benefits to people, oftentimes ecosystem services. So it could be potatoes, it could be milk, it could be pollination, it could be carbon sequestration. And the basic idea behind natural capital is the insight that most environmental problems are really social and economic problems that happen to be sort of impacted on the environment, and you can't maintain the vitality of the biosphere unless you have some way to value nature more explicitly in policy decisions. And I can see hackles. Actually, I don't even know what a hackle is, but I can feel hackles starting to rise. I'm not talking about cost-benefit analysis. Okay, there's a place for that. I think a very small place. There's a place for it, but I don't think so. I don't think so here. It's much more basic, and it builds off a phrase Tim was using. So I called Michael Jenkins, who founded a group called Forest Trends. I think he phrased it perfectly. He said, our challenge is how do you make trees worth more standing than cut down? Right? How do you make trees worth more standing than cut down? And to me, that's the fundamental challenge, long-term, of conservation. Right? So, and natural capital accounting is a way to get at that. There's a lot of growing interest, and has been over the last decade, in mapping natural capital, valuing it, and modeling it. And you've got a lot of different groups doing it. You've got NGOs, Natural Capital, the project based out of Stanford, but a lot of international interest as well. Forest Trends, UN has got an operation going as well. And the idea behind it is sort of threefold. The first is to reveal to society the value of nature. The second, as Tim was saying, is to guide financial flows and therefore incentives. And the third is to track and assess performance. And the best example I know of this is something called GEP, which stands for Gross Ecological Product. Obviously, it's modeled after GDP. And the way that the advocates of this phrase, which I think is great, is they say just as the Great Depression exposed the urgent need for better macroeconomic performance metrics, so does our current great degradation of natural capital make it imperative to track ecological performance. Right? So the idea basically is we need sort of a macro way to measure this. And essentially, it's an accounting method that really is premised on the idea of GDP, that you can find these metrics that can tell us how we're doing overall. There's a US initiative. Many of you know there's an executive order that came out, 14072, for those of you who track these things. And it basically is to develop statistics for environmental and economic decisions and essentially start natural capital accounting. We'll see what happens with the Trump administration. This may continue. It may be, in many respects, I think it's going to be below the surface. A lot of work on ecosystem services was ignored by the first Trump administration. So we'll see if that continues or not. What's more interesting, frankly, is what's happening outside the US. So the United Nations has adopted something called SEA, which is the System of Environmental Economic Accounting. It's a framework, and it's basically agreed concepts, definitions, classifications, rules. It's been adopted, it was adopted in 2021. There are currently 90 countries that have actually developed SEA accounts. 15 of them, I think, are actually the real deal, quite serious. And the leader in this turns out to be China, which is a little surprising. I was there in June, and I was basically, me and a guy called Steve Pulaski, some of you may know about, he's an economist who does a lot of this kind of work. We were sitting at a table like this, long table. Steve and I were here, and there were 20 officials from the Ministry of Natural Resources, which is a very powerful ministry in China, and they were just peppering us with questions about natural capital accounting. And frankly, they're just way ahead on this because of the GEP they've adopted for regional management. So there's a lot going on there. The second aspect of this that I want to highlight is something you may have heard of called the TNFD. It's modeled on the TCFD. I apologize for the acronyms. It's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And it's based on an initiative from about 5-6 years ago called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And the TCFD has been very effective. It basically is these rules for how companies identify the impacts of climate on their supply chain and their operations. And TNFD, which just finished literally last year, they came out with the standards. And the idea basically is to help companies assess their direct impacts and their supply chain vulnerabilities. And it's not a small thing. There are 320 companies, 46 nations, over $4 trillion in market cap that are involved in this. And it's literally being rolled out right now. We'll see what comes from it. My own view, I've been involved with some of the early stage work. And it's a way basically to get companies to have a much better assessment of their reliance and their dependence on natural capital. There's a lot of interest right now. Natural capital is not climate, and they're following the climate playbook, and there are some concerns about that. We can talk about later if you want. Let me sort of have a quick sort of qualification. This approach of natural cap accounting, is intentionally reductive. It's intentionally reductive. No one who's involved in this thinks that you can capture economically the value of a forest or other natural products. We're not stupid. But we're seeing that what's happening is not sufficient. And there's got to be, so for me, it's not an either or. It's not either regulation or natural capital accounting. It's yes and. And the and, I think, needs to be a lot bigger than it has been. And that's the idea behind it. What's also interesting is some of the major figures behind this are ecologists. So Gretchen Daly, Paul Ehrlich, a bunch of other folks, they see this as a very important way to promote biodiversity as well. So this isn't some kind of sort of greenwashing. It can be used for greenwashing, but that's not where it's coming from. Second thing I want to talk about just briefly is rights of nature. So I co-created a course for this semester. I never taught it before with the historian Jill Lepore. We're teaching it here at Harvard. It's joint law school, joint college. And essentially, it's trying to figure out what is this rights of nature thing, other than making it, we feel good about it. And it's got enormous student interest in it. And let me sort of share a few things that we found, because I think there's some aspects of this that are pretty cool. So in the US, rights of nature is pretty active. There have been 83 different ordinances or laws that have been adopted around the country. The first was 2006. Most of those have been in the last decade. These have been largely performative. So, if you're excited about rights of nature, cross the border, right? Because we'll talk about it if you want, but the US is really not where the action is. The action turns out to be in countries like Ecuador, like Colombia, like New Zealand, like Spain, and it's real. We've actually been doing these case studies. And they're very different motivations, different strategies. Sometimes it's a legal strategy. Sometimes it's a political strategy. Sometimes it's community organizing. Sometimes it's indigenous co-governance. All right, one thing I've realized is there is no single rights of nature approach. But what's particularly interesting is that these are happening, and they're happening rapidly in a lot of these countries, and there's a lot of interest that's growing in this. And what I've been left with, sort of, think about rights of nature, is if you look back at sort of the eras of environmental law, you can pick eras, right? There's the sort of the common law era, there's the explosion in the 1970s of these new laws, there's a retrenchment, the rise of cost-benefit analysis. I think that we're possibly in a new era where there's much more focus on environmental rights. Again, less so in the US. Our legal system is not as open to that, but other countries for sure they are. And it's been kind of fun and weird to sort of look at this and say, maybe 10, 20 years from now, folks will look back and say this was sort of the start of this era. Maybe not, right? It's impossible to know, but there are enough folks in this room with flecks of gray or more in their hair who, when you look back, you are also, I think, in some of these sort of nascent movements. So that's what's exciting me, Lisa.
Thank you. Great panel so far. I invite you to ask some questions, but I will start, and this will be directed to both Tim and Jim, but of course, Rachel, if you want to fold in, of course, you're always welcome. So you both described some opportunities for private capital and lending to play a larger role in biodiversity conservation. What kinds of policies would allow for further opportunities or further growth in this arena?
Oh, you go first.
Sure. I'll just give an example. In the climate space, America is respected around the world for the creative programs we've created to fund renewable energy transition or building efficiency or a pile of other things. In the wildlife conservation space, the rest of the world, but also America, are still basically using grant programs. So, to give an example of something that comes up in the context of a lot of infrastructure development in the United States, it's an absence of mitigation credits, of offset credits for a transmission line or anything else. And so if you thought about industrial policy for climate adaptation, one of the things you want to do is to say, in these places, we're going to be building more things, more solar, more wind transmission to connect them, or whatever those things are, right? Those things are obviously happening across our country. When there's no supply of mitigation credits, and I think at least many of the people I talk to at agencies would back this up, when there's no supply of mitigation credits, then they can't ask for it. But when there is a supply available or multiple supplies available, including owners, often farmers and ranchers involved, who want to sell those credits, it becomes much less escapable to have to invest in them. So you could set up a finance program, basically, where somebody like the Department of Interior, could be run through the Treasury, are making either recoverable grants available, so in other words, the money is a grant, but if you find a buyer for the project, you have to pay us back, or loan programs available to produce a supply of mitigation credits. And it's kind of a strategy where you take risks, right? Like, we think we're gonna need lots of restoration for this set of ecosystems or species, and you might be wrong, but it's a way to proactively build out a resource of mitigation that you need in the context of permitting that could be really useful. And if you did that, the benefit of loan programs, loan guarantees, recoverable grants, is that you can attract a lot of private finance to pay for those things as well, including pay for it all upfront at the beginning, which is for HCPs, right? Like, pulling lots of money into land protection today rather than 5 years from now saves you 3 to 5% interest on the price of land over that period of time. So there's a huge value in the kind of cost of capital.
Yeah, I mean, just building off this briefly, I think we're going to have to start thinking more seriously about the role of offsets. I mean, offsets have become kind of a four-letter word. And when John Oliver does a 23-minute segment ridiculing offsets, you know it's in trouble as a policy instrument. But, you know, as Tim said and I said, we've got to find ways to bring more private capital into changing the incentive structure. And, you know, what's interesting is some people say offsets are fatally flawed. And to me, that's just a sort of rank double standard. You look at any government program, and there are additionality problems, right? The folks are sort of, you know, running over themselves about the IRA. A lot of the IRA subsidies, a lot of folks would have done this anyway. And folks are not saying the IRA is fatally flawed. Now, the question obviously is, are you getting some real additionality? And I think that's actually where there needs to be a lot more focus. And so I would be very happy if the government and private certification really drill down on what's going to be legitimate and what's not going to be legitimate. The Wild West we have right now, I think, is really problematic.
Agreed. Well, Rachel mentioned that she was going to talk about climate change on our last slide, so I'm definitely going to give her a chance now, and the others on the panel as well. So it's obviously abundantly clear that the effects of climate change further complicate our efforts to conserve and protect a listed species. I worked on the Indo-Pacific listing of corals that Rachel was talking about in the Pacific Islands, and you know, our heads were spinning on how we deal with this monumental listing, the largest in the department's history, in the face of climate change. So with that, from your perspective, Rachel, what are one or two things that need to happen in the next 50 years to deal with listed species and climate change?
Just that small task. You know, I think I would just say, you know, in the context of corals, that there's been a lot of arguments that, and you know, why should we stop this project from moving forward? And I talked to Miri about this a little bit before, when this species is going to be dead from climate change soon anyway. So why wouldn't I build this, you know, development? And I think that the way to look at that is that we have to be controlling all of these local factors when we're dealing with species that are struggling to survive in an era of climate change. So in the context of corals, we're talking about the last 2% of these staghorn corals that I showed existing in Florida when they were listed in 2006, and it's way below that now. And we had a population of them at the Port of Miami that were thriving. And this is exactly the kind of brood stock that we need to reseed the reefs of the future. Of the most resilient corals that we have left are the ones that are still there, that are most likely to survive in an era of climate change. And so we have to eliminate every local factor that we can that could be leading to the decline of these species until we can get the, climate global challenges under control and give them a chance to survive until then. So that means, not dumping dredging sediment on top of them, getting sewage spills under control and septic tanks and other kinds of toxic pollution that we're dumping into the ocean, or, analogies for other terrestrial ecosystems. But it only makes that development all the more important to be thinking about its impact on the listed species, because they're dealing with these global influences that are struggling to survive anyway. So, I would argue that what we're doing is giving them a chance to survive until we can hopefully get the climate threats under control. And indeed, a lot of coral restoration deals with this criticism all the time, because we saw last summer absolutely off the charts heat wave in Florida. And people have been doing coral restoration. We chatted a little bit about this at lunch, but people have been doing coral restoration in Florida their entire careers for decades. This one organization in the Keys had outplanted 50,000 of these staghorn corals. And after the heat wave was over, in 1 week, 13 of them were still alive. And a lot of people said, why are we doing coral restoration? They're all gonna die anyway from climate change. Why, this is not useful, input of resources into these species. They're circling the drain. But what sort of I take away from that is, well, there's 13 left that can now potentially be the most resilient, that survived a heat wave that no one ever anticipated could be that severe for that long. How do we learn from what the genetic information in these 13 and potentially start a restoration program with the genotypic diversity that we need to capture the most resilient corals? So one thing my PhD advisor is doing now is bringing corals from Central America into Florida and crossbreeding them with Floridian corals. And this, when I was doing my PhD 12 years ago, we would never be allowed to do this. But they just got permission from the state of Florida to outplant these interbred corals onto the reef. And it's the same species, it's just assisted migration within the range. And the early signs are that they are indeed much more heat tolerant than the current corals. So the ones that they had put out there survived really well during this last summer's heat stress event. There's also the idea that we just need to build heat stress tolerance into restoration programs generally, which NOAA really has never done, and most organizations have never done. So how do we sort of stress test larval corals? 50% of them survive, those get grown up, we do it again, and kind of winnow down so that the targets of restoration we're actually putting out on the reef are the ones that are more disease resistant, more heat resistant, more likely to survive. There's trade-offs with that. Maybe they grow slower, but they're more likely to survive, for example. And all those things need to be taken into account. But I think there is hope for these corals, and switching the way that we think about restoration in the context of an era of climate change, rather than doing things the same way, which obviously we're not making it to the finish line the old way of doing things. So I think we also need to scale up significantly, because we're doing tens of thousands a year. We need to be doing like millions a year and figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I'll be really brief. It's a huge question. Army Corps takes an average of 4 years to permit a wetland restoration. 4 years for a wetland restoration. We just can't do that. If we're gonna work and really solve climate change, we have to actively manage millions and millions of acres of land and water resources, and we don't have the time to go that slow. Another example is Alala, Hawaiian crow. When I left Hawaii in 2002, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the state, were studying putting the crow on a different island, on the island of Maui, where it was historically, or a different species was historically found. They're just about to do that today. We don't have time to spend 20 years deciding, making sure there's no risk to wildlife management choices. We can do that, and we'll get a very few things that we save, and lots of other stuff will fall by the wayside.
Oh, that's good.
Great.
So we have 5 minutes. I'm going to invite the audience, but I have more questions, so no worries. But in our 5 minutes, I'm going to turn another question to Jim. So,
Lisa,
oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see. Apologies.
Can I answer?
Of course.
So I think this is mainly a question for Tim, but it could be anybody. A lot of the different strategies you're talking about rely on having some decent but quick method of accounting for ecosystem or habitat status. And I'm wondering if you could say something about the state of play of our ability to do that for different habitat types. So you gave a terrestrial forest habitat example. I kind of understand how that would work for wetlands or small streams. The example I'm wondering about where it might be harder is maybe bigger aquatic ecosystems. But then the broader question is, is this something we can do just for a few habitat types, or do you think it's something that is really at this stage generalizable across a lot of different habitat types?
I think at this stage, it's generalizable across a lot of terrestrial habitat types, forest, desert, grassland, steppe ecosystems. But again, the $6 billion of venture capital invested in nature tech. Those are companies that are just putting piles of money into really creative ways to measure species diversity and ecosystem condition. It's going to happen fast, right? It really is going to happen fast. And so what we're missing, though, is kind of government support and validation for some of those techniques in the ecosystems where we're most comfortable. So if you thought about it as a staged process, you'd say, okay, well, in these places, we're pretty confident that some of these methods are a pretty good way to account for nature, and we still have more work to do. But that stepwise process is just not happening so much here. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's a key question, right? But I mean, I want to tie it into a bigger issue, which is permitting reform or streamlining. I mean, this has happened in every administration, since Carter. These pushes forward. I think there's going to be legislation. It's already starting to happen in the next administration. It would have happened whether Harris had won or not. And I think this type of issue should be part of the discussion, which is sloppy but fast. Something we have to consider as we sort of consider the new challenges that we're facing.
Thank you.
So my question follows up on that. I really do appreciate everybody on the panel, particularly I know Jim and Tim from before, and I appreciate the creativity in you've always both tried to do and try to deal with these sorts of problems. And I agree, I appreciate the effort in thinking about the need to sort of find value out of things. And I always feel concerned about trying to equate price with value. And I know that's not what you guys are doing, but there's always that concern that comes with any sort of valuation. Tim, there were just two words that you used, and I maybe all of you could speak to this, because I also think it was used by some of the other panelists too, that I find really puzzling, and I've thought about them for a while, but that were used in this context, in the context of climate change, and that is restoration. And so you used the term, Tim, universal metric. I appreciated Jim's comment on the second one about we recognize that this is reductivist and that's really not really possible. But when we talk about a universal metric, to me, that it relates more to what Dave was getting at, that it's trying to sort of create a reductivist, sort of sloppy approach. And we know from wetlands restoration that one wetland in Mexico isn't where they're saying a wetland in California or wherever like that. So just I riff on these different comments, but what do you mean by restoration in the context of climate change? And how can you really have a metric? I mean, these are things I've been wrestling with, so I'd love to get your thoughts on it. So.
You want to say anyone?
Well, you're the one who's attacking.
Okay. I'm not going to try to go after the restoration side. On universal metric, and it's shorthand in a limited amount of time. Grades A through F are a universal metric. An SAT score is a universal metric, and that is not the way we measure our children. We have teachers and reports and report cards, and there's a lot of detailed substance that's unique across global school systems, right? But we have a few things that are helpful for comparison. Universal metrics are relevant to government trying to deploy national strategies, multinational companies trying to figure out, do they invest in Colombia or Ireland? So I think that what I'm trying to convey is that there's a few components, like how important is this ecosystem in the country? How likely is this project to succeed? How many species are there? Those are components of universal metrics where there could be quite a bit of variation at the end of the day in the system that people use on the ground to manage something.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add, and I guess we're going to close after this, I think it's very hard for agencies, right? Because we're basically telling agencies you got to do it faster, but it's still got to be rigorous, and they're just hanging out there if it goes south. And so I get that this is difficult, but this is where the field is going. I think it's where it has to go. I think it's a challenge for all of us to figure out how do we sort of, rethink basically how to ensure a comfort level with the protection we're giving, with the restoration we're doing, with the mitigation we're doing, but it's got to be faster and it's got to be cheaper.
So are we, one more question, or are we done?
I had a quick comment on this exact
Okay.
topic, if I could just jump in.
Sure.
There is a national strategy to develop statistics, and this is a White House process. And when we met with them, it sounded like it was starting out fairly broad scale, and it might take a while to get down to the on-the-ground level but I think it would lead to better decisions if we had these types of information available. And it leads to, like the economic incentive approach you're talking, Tim, I think we need to have baselines so we know what to do and how much.
How about a big round of applause for our panel?